I was standing in the middle of Times Square, watching my ex-fiance's face crumble on every screen around me. The words, "Breaking. Senator's son threatens child. Charity fraud exposed" flashed across the billboards, while the audio of Julian Davenport's venomous threat to a terrified 10-year-old boy echoed through the speakers. His perfect mask had finally shattered, and the whole world was watching. 3 months ago, I thought I was going to marry into the American dream. Now, I was the woman who burned it all down. Before I tell you how I took down one of New York's most powerful families, if this story speaks to you, if you've ever felt trapped by someone who wore a perfect mask, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Your support means everything, and trust me, you'll want to stick around for this. Let me take you back to where it all started, because this story doesn't begin with romance or even with Julian. It begins with my mother's hands. Elena Chen's hands were the first thing I really remember from childhood. Rough and reddened from years of scrubbing other people's floors, washing other people's dishes, folding other people's laundry. She came to New York from Vietnam when she was 19, speaking broken English and carrying nothing but a single suitcase and a determination that seemed almost superhuman to me as I grew older. My earliest memories are of my mother leaving our Queens apartment before dawn, taking 2 buses and a train to clean Upper East Side townhouses for families whose children attended elite schools. She'd return after dark, exhausted, but still made dinner, helped with homework, and told me education was the key to a different life. When I was 7, she took me to work at a Central Park penthouse. Walking through those rooms, each bigger than our entire apartment, I watched her work 6 hours straight, making everything perfect for the family's return. On the subway home, I asked if the people were nice. She stared at her reflection and said something I never forgot. "They don't see me, Ava. I'm invisible." That's how rich people stay rich. They build their comfort on invisible people and never think about what it costs. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep me in good schools and pay for SAT prep. When I got into Columbia on partial scholarship, she cried. The scholarship covered tuition, not living expenses or books or the hidden costs of an elite university. She kept cleaning houses so I could be seen. I worked every part-time job I could between classes, graduated with $30,000 in loans, moved into a Brooklyn walk-up with roommates, and took a job at an online news site that barely covered rent. For 3 years, I covered local politics and housing issues, stories about people like my mother. I was invited to press conferences occasionally, but remained firmly minor league. That's where I was when I met Julian Davenport. It was a Tuesday in April at a press conference where Senator Harrison Davenport announced an education bill. Julian, the senator's communications director, was striking with his polished appearance and confident handling of hostile questions. After the conference, he approached me in the lobby. "Ava Chen, right? From City Voice? I read your housing scandal piece. Solid work." I was stunned he knew my byline. We talked for 15 minutes about journalism, and he asked me to coffee. Our first date was 3 hours at a West Village cafe. He told me about growing up under a senator's expectations, initially wanting to be a writer. I told him about my mother and wanting to tell stories that mattered. That dinner led to walks through the city, his stories about architecture revealing genuine love beneath the privilege. Over 2 months, our relationship intensified. Julian was attentive in ways I'd never experienced. He remembered details, brought books, sent flowers with inside jokes. He introduced me to gallery openings, jazz clubs, restaurants where waiters knew his name. He came to community meetings in Queens, met me at Brooklyn diners, respected my boundaries when I refused financial help. My roommates thought I'd won the lottery. A hot, successful guy who's emotionally available and respectful? Marry him immediately, Maya said. But my mother wasn't celebrating. 6 weeks in, when I told her about Julian over Sunday dinner, her whole body went still. Davenport, Harrison Davenport's son. "He's different, Mom," I said defensively. She sat me down at her kitchen table. "Ava, I've worked for families like the Davenports for 30 years. I've been invisible in their homes, seen things they'd never show the world. These families have 2 faces, one for the public, charming and generous. The other for their staff, cold and cruel, treating us as less than human. I've watched them smile at guests, then scream at housekeepers. I've seen charity galas while they pay staff poverty wages. People can be different from their parents," I protested. She sighed. "Can they? When raised in that world, benefiting from that system every day, never struggling? In 30 years, I haven't seen it. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, especially when the tree is rotten." We argued, one of our few real fights. I accused her of prejudice. She insisted she was protecting me. I left angry and misunderstood. I pushed her warnings away. Julian continued being attentive, taking me to theaters and concerts, talking about our future, introducing me to his friends. Everyone seemed to accept me without the class judgment I'd expected. But small cracks appeared. Julian made dismissive comments about service workers, jokes with an edge. When a barista got his order wrong, he smiled and said, "Must be nice to have a job where competence is optional." At restaurants, he'd critique nervous waiters' appearance and education after they left. In Brooklyn, he called my neighborhood charming, in a tone suggesting he was slumming it. In Manhattan, he'd suggest I dress up more for certain venues. I rationalized these moments. Everyone has flaws. Julian was good to me in so many ways. These seemed petty to focus on. I was probably reading too much into things, bringing my own insecurities where they didn't belong. Then came the night that changed everything, though I didn't recognize it as a turning point at the time. We'd been dating for 3.5 months when Julian invited me to a charity gala at the Plaza Hotel, one of those black-tie Manhattan affairs I'd only read about. He'd mentioned it a week in advance, giving me time to find a dress, and I'd put it on my credit card even though I couldn't really afford it. A floor-length black gown that cost more than my monthly groceries but was apparently still considered modest by Manhattan gala standards. The night of the event, Julian picked me up in a car service, and when I got in, he looked me over with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You look beautiful," he said, but then added, "Is that the dress you're wearing?" I felt my stomach drop. "Is something wrong with it?" He smiled and kissed my cheek. "No, of course not. It's lovely. I just thought maybe something with a bit more presence, you know? But you look great. Really." The damage was done, though. I spent the entire car ride to Manhattan feeling self-conscious, wondering if everyone would be able to tell my dress was from a department store sale rack instead of a designer boutique. When we arrived at the plaza and I saw the other women in attendance, my fears seemed confirmed. Diamonds that were clearly real, not costume jewelry, gowns that had probably been custom-made, hair and makeup that spoke of hours in expensive salons. Julian seemed to sense my discomfort and squeezed my hand as we entered the ballroom. "Hey, you're with me. That's all that matters." His reassurance helped, and I tried to relax into the evening. The ballroom was stunning. All crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths and centerpieces that probably cost more than my rent. We were seated at a table near the front, surrounded by people Julian knew from his father's political and social circles. Throughout dinner, I felt like I was being evaluated. The woman next to me, dressed in emerald silk and dripping with jewelry, asked polite questions that felt more like an interrogation. Where did I go to school? What did my parents do? What neighborhood did I live in? Each answer seemed to confirm some hypothesis she was forming about my place in the social hierarchy. When I mentioned I was a journalist, she said, "Oh, how interesting. That must be very gratifying work," in a tone that suggested it was anything but. After dinner, Senator Harrison Davenport took the stage to speak. I'd met him briefly once before, at a political event Julian had brought me to, and he'd been politely distant, shaking my hand while looking past me to someone more important. But tonight he was in performance mode, and I had to admit he was compelling. He spoke about responsibility, about those who have been obligated to help those who have not, about the importance of family values and community support. Then he introduced Julian, asking him to say a few words about the foundation's work. Julian stood, straightened his tuxedo jacket, and walked to the stage with a confidence that seemed as natural as breathing. His speech was perfect, hitting all the right notes about obligation and privilege and making a difference. He spoke about his own education, about how fortunate he'd been, about how he wanted to help create opportunities for others. He was articulate and passionate, and I felt a surge of pride watching him. But then something happened that I've replayed in my mind 1,000 times since. A server, a young guy who couldn't have been more than 20, was refilling water glasses at the table next to the stage. He reached across to fill a glass at the far end of the table and accidentally bumped Julian's arm as he passed. Red wine from the glass Julian had been holding sloshed forward, splashing across Julian's tuxedo shirt and dripping down onto his expensive leather shoes. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The server looked absolutely terrified, immediately started apologizing, reaching for a napkin. Julian's face did something strange. For just a split second, maybe 2 seconds, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Pure, undiluted hatred. His jaw clenched, his free hand curled into a fist so tight his knuckles went white, and he looked at that server the way you might look at an insect you wanted to crush. Then, like a switch flipping, The warmth flooded back into his expression. He smiled, touched the server's shoulder gently, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey, accidents happen. Don't worry about it at all." The room exhaled, people nodded approvingly at his grace, and the server backed away, still apologizing. Julian made a joke about red wine being good for the soul if not for the wardrobe, got a laugh from the crowd, and continued his speech without missing a beat. But I had seen that flash of rage, that moment when the mask had slipped, and I couldn't unsee it. I watched Julian for the rest of the evening with new eyes, looking for other cracks, other moments when his real feelings might leak through the perfect exterior. I saw the way his smile didn't reach his eyes when he was talking to people he considered beneath him. I noticed how his grip on my arm tightened, almost painfully, when he was steering me through the crowd, and how he loosened it immediately if someone was watching. After the gala, in the car on the way to drop me off, Julian was expansive, riding high on the success of the evening. "That went well, don't you think?" My father was pleased. "He thinks you made a good impression." I should have been happy about that, but instead I felt uneasy. "Julian," I said carefully, "that moment with the server, when the wine spilled. You seemed really angry." He looked at me with surprise. "What? No, I handled it well. I was gracious about it." "I know," I said. "You were gracious, but just for a second, before you smiled, I saw your face. You looked furious." Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ava, you're imagining things." I was momentarily startled, that's all. "You're being overly analytical." He said it in a way that made me feel foolish, like I'd misread an obvious situation. "Maybe," I said, even though I knew what I'd seen. The rest of the ride was quiet, and when Julian walked me to my building, he kissed me goodnight and said, "You worry too much. Everything's fine. Better than fine." After he left, I climbed the 5 flights to my apartment and lay awake for hours, my mother's words echoing in my head. 2 faces. One for the world, one for people they consider beneath them. I tried to push the doubts away, tried to return to the easy confidence I'd felt in our relationship before that night. But doubt, once planted, is hard to kill. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself watching Julian more carefully, analyzing his interactions, looking for patterns. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing them. The casual cruelty disguised as humor, the subtle condescension toward anyone in a service position. The way he spoke about his own privilege as if it were somehow evidence of his merit rather than his luck. I was wrestling with these observations, trying to decide if I was being unfair or finally seeing clearly, when Julian announced that we'd be spending the upcoming weekend at his family's estate in Connecticut. "It's time you officially met my parents," he said, "not just at events, but in their home. They want to get to know you better." He said it like it was an honor, an invitation to something special, and I suppose in his world it was. My immediate reaction was anxiety. Meeting parents always felt like a test, but meeting the parents of someone like Julian, in their territory, felt especially daunting. I called my mother to tell her, hoping for reassurance. Instead, she said quietly, "Be careful, Ava. Watch how they treat their staff. That will tell you everything you need to know." The week leading up to the Connecticut visit, Julian was full of instructions. He framed them as helpful tips, but they felt more like directives, a list of things I needed to do or not do to make the right impression. My father doesn't like talking politics at the table, so maybe avoid that. My mother is very particular about appearances, so dress conservatively but elegantly. Don't mention the scholarship to Columbia. It might create an awkward class dynamic. Actually, maybe just say your mother is in hospitality management rather than specifying that she's a house cleaner. Each instruction felt like a small betrayal, like I was being asked to edit out the parts of myself and my history that didn't fit their world. When I hesitated, Julian sensed my resistance. "I'm just trying to make this easier for you, Ava. My parents can be old-fashioned. I want this weekend to go well because I'm serious about us, about our future. Can you just trust me on this?" The morning we left for Connecticut, Julian picked me up early. I'd spent an hour getting ready, trying to find the balance between looking nice and not trying too hard, and when I got in the car, Julian looked me over and nodded approval. "Perfect. You look exactly right." The comment should have been reassuring, but instead it felt like I'd passed a test I hadn't known I was taking. The drive to Connecticut took about 2 hours, and as we left the city behind, Julian's demeanor shifted. He seemed to sit up straighter, his jaw tightening, his casual warmth cooling into something more formal, He ran through more instructions, his tone becoming less suggestive and more commanding. Remember, compliment my mother's garden. She's very proud of it. Don't ask too many questions about my father's political positions. Don't talk about your reporting work unless they bring it up first. And Ava, please, just try to fit in. Don't make waves. That last instruction stung. I looked out the window at the passing landscape, the city giving way to suburbs, giving way to genuine countryside, and felt a growing dread. What was I walking into? Why did fitting in require so much careful performance? But I didn't say anything. I told myself I was overthinking it, that every family had their dynamics, that one weekend wouldn't kill me. The Davenport estate appeared like something from a different era, a massive colonial-style mansion set back from the road behind gates and surrounded by what must have been 20 acres of manicured grounds. Everything about it screamed old money and power. The driveway alone was longer than my street in Brooklyn. Julian pulled up to the front entrance, and immediately a uniformed staff member appeared to take our bags. "Good morning, Mr. Julian," the man said, not making eye contact. Julian nodded at him without acknowledgement, as if the man were a piece of furniture that had spoken. Eleanor Davenport appeared at the front door, elegant in cream-colored linen that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She was in her late 50s, perfectly maintained in that way that requires expensive procedures and personal trainers. Her hair was salon-perfect, her makeup subtle and flawless, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable. She smiled at Julian, kissed the air near both his cheeks, then turned her attention to me. "Ava," she said, and the way she pronounced my name made it sound slightly exotic, slightly foreign. "How lovely to see you again. Do come in." Her handshake was brief and cool, her eyes scanning me in a way that felt more like an appraisal than a greeting. I followed them into the house, and every step deeper into the mansion felt like entering enemy territory. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from old money. High ceilings with crown molding, original artwork that belonged in museums, antique furniture that was probably worth more than everything I owned combined. Everything was perfectly placed, perfectly maintained, perfectly lifeless. There was no clutter, no personal mess, no sense that actual humans lived and breathed in these spaces. It was more like a very expensive stage set, beautiful and cold and completely sterile. Senator Harrison Davenport emerged from his study, a tall, imposing figure with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He shook my hand firmly while looking just past my shoulder, already scanning for whatever or whoever was more significant than the young woman his son had brought home. "Ava, welcome. Julian speaks highly of you." It was the kind of statement that sounded warm but actually said nothing. Lunch was served in a dining room that could have hosted 20 people, though it was just the four of us at one end of a table that stretched the length of the room. The meal itself was served by staff who moved silently and efficiently, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. I noticed they never spoke unless spoken to, never made eye contact, and seemed to anticipate needs before they were expressed. It was exactly the kind of invisible labor my mother had described. The conversation during lunch was polite and probing, with Senator Davenport asking questions that seemed casual but felt like they were designed to establish exactly where I fit in the social hierarchy. "So, Columbia, wonderful school, family tradition, or were you the first to attend an Ivy?" Translation: Is your family old money or new money or no money? "I was the first in my family to attend college," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My mother valued education highly and made significant sacrifices to make it possible. "How admirable," Eleanor said, in a tone that made admirable sound like a synonym for quaint. "And your mother, what does she do?" This was the moment Julian had warned me about. I thought about his suggestion to say hospitality management, thought about how easy it would be to smooth over this rough edge, to make myself more palatable to these people, but something in me rebelled. I heard my mother's voice in my head, remembered her sitting across from me at her small kitchen table, her work-worn hands flat on the surface, telling me about two faces. "My mother is a house cleaner," I said clearly. "She works for several families in Manhattan. She's done it for 30 years to support me and give me opportunities she never had." The silence that followed my statement felt loaded. Eleanor's smile became more fixed. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Julian's hand found my knee under the table and squeezed. Hard, not affectionate. "Warning. How hard-working," Eleanor finally said. "That kind of diligence is rare these days, though I imagine you're eager to move beyond that world, to embrace the opportunities your education provided. It was a graceful way of saying she expected me to distance myself from my origins now that I'd climbed into her son's world. Actually, I said, I'm incredibly proud of my mother. She taught me everything important about integrity and hard work and treating people with dignity. Harrison cut into his steak with deliberate precision. Dignity is important, of course, but so is understanding where one fits in the natural order of things. Society functions because we all accept our roles. Some people lead, some people follow, and some people serve. There's no shame in any of it, as long as everyone stays in their lane. He said it pleasantly, as if he were describing something as obvious as gravity, but the message was clear. I was expected to be grateful for being allowed out of my lane. I felt Julian's hand squeeze my knee again, more insistent this time. I understood what he was asking. Stop talking. Don't push back. Smile and nod and get through this lunch. Part of me wanted to explode, to challenge every assumption Harrison had just laid out. But another part of me, the part that had learned to navigate spaces where I didn't belong, told me to be strategic. I smiled and said nothing, but I felt something hardening inside me. After lunch, Eleanor suggested a walk in the garden while the men talked business. The dismissal was casual and absolute. I followed her outside, and I had to admit the grounds were spectacular. Formal gardens with carefully arranged flowers, fountains, stone pathways winding through perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything was controlled, designed, maintained. Even nature wasn't allowed to be wild here. Eleanor walked beside me, pointing out various plants and features, and I made the appropriate appreciative noises Julian had instructed me to make. Then she stopped near a rose garden and turned to face me directly. Ava, I'm going to be frank with you because I think you seem like an intelligent young woman. Julian is fond of you, and that's lovely, but you need to understand what a life with him would require. She gestured around us, encompassing the house, the grounds, the entire world they inhabited. This life, our life, it comes with expectations. There are certain standards we maintain, certain appearances we uphold. Julian will eventually run for office himself, following in his father's footsteps. His wife will need to be not just supportive but exemplary. She'll need to be comfortable in these circles, understand the unspoken rules, know how to navigate society at this level. Her eyes met mine, and there was something almost pitying in her expression. You're clearly ambitious, and you've worked hard to get where you are. But there's a difference between attending Columbia on scholarship and being to the manor born. It's not your fault, of course. You can't help where you came from. But ask yourself honestly, dear, are you willing to spend the rest of your life feeling like you're playing a role? Always having to try just a bit harder, always being aware that you don't quite belong? The words were delivered gently, even kindly, but they were designed to wound. This was the maternal version of what Harrison had said at lunch. Know your place. Stay in your lane. Don't pretend to be something you're not. I felt anger rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Davenport. But I don't see my background as something to overcome. I see it as a source of strength, and Julian seems to value that about me. Eleanor smiled, a cool expression that didn't touch her eyes. Yes, Julian has always had a romantic streak, but romance fades, dear. Marriage is about partnership, about shared values and compatible backgrounds. I'm just suggesting you both think carefully about whether this is really the right fit. She turned and began walking back toward the house, clearly considering the conversation finished. I stood in that perfect garden, surrounded by controlled beauty, and felt more alone than I had in years. That evening, there was a small dinner party. Several of Harrison's political allies and their spouses joined us, and I sat through 3 hours of conversation where I was simultaneously on display and invisible. People asked me questions but didn't really listen to my answers. They made jokes I didn't understand because they referenced shared experiences from schools and clubs and social circles I'd never been part of. Julian was charming and attentive when others were watching, but when it was just us between conversations, his jaw was tight and he barely made eye contact. After the guests left and we'd retired to the sitting room for coffee, Harrison turned the conversation to politics, despite his earlier prohibition against it. But this wasn't discussion. It was pronouncement. He held forth on immigration policy, on education, on healthcare, each opinion delivered with the certainty of someone who'd never had to personally deal with any of these issues. Several times he said things that contradicted the compassionate public positions he took in speeches, and when I opened my mouth to point out the inconsistency, Julian's hand shot out and gripped my wrist under the table, hard enough to hurt. Finally, the evening ended. Julian walked me to the guest room I'd been assigned, several doors down from his own. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and said quietly, "Thank you for today. I know it was hard. They'll warm up to you, I promise. You just need to give them time and try to understand their perspective." I looked at this man I'd thought I was falling in love with. This man who'd spent an entire day watching his parents condescend to and belittle me without once defending me, and I felt something break inside me. "Julian, they were awful to me today. Your father basically said poor people should know their place. Your mother told me I'm not good enough for you, and you sat there and said nothing. You squeezed my leg to shut me up, but you never once stood up for me or for the values you claim to have." He looked uncomfortable, ran his hand through his hair. "They're from a different generation, Ava. You can't expect them to have the same worldview we do. And honestly, you were being a bit confrontational. If you'd just been more diplomatic, more accommodating, they would have responded better." It was the first time he'd explicitly blamed me for his parents' behavior, and hearing him say it out loud clarified something that had been building all day. This wasn't a problem that would get better. This was who Julian was, underneath the polish. Someone who valued his family's approval more than defending me. Someone who expected me to change and adapt to fit his world while never questioning whether that world was worth fitting into. I slept badly that night in the guest room with its expensive linens and perfect furnishings. I kept hearing Eleanor's question, "Are you willing to spend the rest of your life feeling like you're playing a role?" And I kept thinking about my mother, about how she'd worked herself to exhaustion so I wouldn't have to make myself small for anyone. About how she'd seen this coming and tried to warn me. The next morning was Sunday, and Julian mentioned that we'd be staying for brunch before heading back to the city. I felt trapped, desperate to leave but unable to without causing a scene. I got dressed and went downstairs to find Eleanor in the breakfast room reading the Times. She looked up as I entered and smiled pleasantly, as if yesterday's conversation had never happened. "Good morning, dear. Coffee?" The ability to compartmentalize, to be cruel and then act like nothing had occurred, was chilling. Harrison and Julian were in the study on a conference call, so it was just Eleanor and me for breakfast. She made small talk about the weather and the garden and an upcoming charity event, all surface pleasantries that avoided anything substantive. I responded on autopilot, my mind already working on how to extricate myself from this relationship. Then, through the window, I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of the property. A boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, was running across the lawn chasing a kite. The bright red kite had broken free from its string and was tumbling through the air toward the trees. The boy was laughing, completely absorbed in the chase, not paying attention to where he was. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and something about his clothes and the way he moved marked him as not belonging to this world of privilege. He reached the trees and grabbed the kite triumphantly, holding it above his head like a trophy. Then I saw Harrison Davenport striding out of the house, moving with frightening speed for a man his age. Julian was right behind him. I stood up from the breakfast table, some instinct telling me that whatever was about to happen was going to be bad. Eleanor followed my gaze and said calmly, "Oh, those are the Martinez children. Their parents work for us. They've been told repeatedly to stay off the main grounds." I was already moving toward the door. By the time I got outside, Harrison had reached the boy and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, yanking him backwards, hard enough that the kid stumbled and dropped his kite. "What the hell do you think you're doing on my property?" Harrison was yelling directly into the boy's face, his own face red with rage. "Were you trying to steal something? Is that what you people do?" The boy was terrified, trying to stammer out an explanation about the kite, but Harrison wasn't listening. "This is trespassing. This is a crime. I should call the police right now and have you arrested." The kid was crying now, his whole body shaking with fear. He was trying to pull away, but Harrison's grip on his collar held him in place. Julian had reached them by now, and I watched, praying that he would intervene, that he would show some decency, that he would prove my mother wrong about people like him. The boy managed to twist away from his father's grip and stumbled, his phone falling from his pocket. It was an old Android with a cracked screen, clearly a hand-me-down or something bought used. The phone landed face up on the grass between Julian and the boy. What happened next will be burned into my memory forever. Julian looked down at that phone, then at the crying child, and I saw that same expression I'd seen at the gala when the server had spilled wine, that flash of cold hatred. But this time it didn't disappear. Julian took a deliberate step forward, positioned his expensive leather shoe over the phone, and pressed down hard. The screen cracked further, the casing buckled, and Julian ground his heel back and forth, destroying it completely. The boy cried out, reaching for his destroyed phone, but Julian kicked it away. Then he leaned down close to the child's ear, and I was close enough now to hear him say in a low, vicious voice, "Listen carefully, you little rat. This is your first lesson about how the world really works. If I ever see you anywhere near this property again, your parents are fired tomorrow. Both of them. And I'll make sure they never work in this county again. I'll tell everyone they're thieves. Do you understand me?" The boy was sobbing, nodding frantically, desperate to get away from this nightmare. Harrison released his collar, and the kid started to run, leaving his kite and his destroyed phone behind. Julian called after him, "Tell your parents to keep you on a shorter leash. Animals need proper training." Something in me snapped. Not just anger, but clarity. Perfect, crystalline clarity about who Julian was, who his family was, what a future with him would mean. I ran forward without thinking, shoving past Julian to scoop up the pieces of the broken phone. "Stop!" I screamed. Both men turned to look at me with identical expressions of surprise. "He's a child. He was just getting his kite. What is wrong with you people?" Julian's face hardened. "Ava, stay out of this. This doesn't concern you." But it did concern me. It concerned me deeply because I'd almost let myself be absorbed into this family, almost convinced myself that their surface charm meant something real, almost traded my values for access to their world. "Like hell it doesn't," I said. I looked at the broken phone in my hands, then at the direction the boy had run, and I made a decision. I'm taking this to him. I'm apologizing to him and his family for your behavior. I started walking toward where I'd seen the boy disappear. Julian caught my arm, his grip painful. "You're embarrassing me, Ava. You're embarrassing yourself. Don't make a scene." I looked at his hand on my arm, at his face that was finally showing me exactly who he was. And I said quietly, "Let go of me." He hesitated, then released my arm. I kept walking, following the path the boy had taken through the trees. Behind me, I heard Eleanor's voice, calm and controlled. "Let her go, Julian. She was never going to work out anyway." The casual dismissal in her tone, the implication that I'd failed some test, that I was the problem rather than their cruelty, it just reinforced that I was making the right choice. I found the boy about a quarter mile from the main house, sitting on the front steps of a small cottage, still crying. When he saw me approaching, he looked terrified and started to run. "Wait," I called out. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help." A woman came out of the cottage, young, maybe mid-20s, and immediately positioned herself between me and the boy. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Ava Chen," I said, holding up the broken phone. "I was at the house and I saw what happened. I'm so sorry. They had no right to treat your brother that way. No right at all." The woman's face was a mixture of fear and anger. "Are you Julian Davenport's girlfriend?" I shook my head. "Not anymore." The woman stared at me for a long moment, then gestured for me to come inside. The cottage was small but warm, filled with family photos and actual signs of life unlike the sterile mansion. The woman introduced herself as Maria Martinez, and the boy was her younger brother Leo. Their parents both worked for the Davenports, her father as a groundskeeper and her mother as a housekeeper. "This isn't the first time," Maria said quietly once Leo had calmed down and was sitting next to her on the couch. "The Davenports treat everyone who works for them like garbage. Your boyfriend, your ex-boyfriend, he's just like his father. Maybe worse because at least Harrison is honest about his contempt. Julian acts charming until you cross some invisible line, and then the real person comes out." She told me stories about other incidents. Workers fired without cause because they'd made minor mistakes. Severance packages withheld through legal intimidation. Constant verbal abuse disguised as jokes or corrections. "My parents stay because the pay is decent and we can't afford to move. Leo and I, we're saving money so we can get them out of here. I work in IT support, trying to build up enough savings for them to retire. But it's slow going." An idea was forming in my mind, something I couldn't quite articulate yet, but that felt important. "Maria, what if there was a way to expose them? To show people what they're really like behind the perfect public image?" She looked at me skeptically. "How? They're powerful. They have lawyers and money and connections. Who's going to listen to us over them?" I thought about my training as an investigative journalist, about every story I'd ever worked on about corruption and abuse of power. People listen when you have evidence. When you have documentation and witnesses and proof they can't deny. Maria's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Leo's phone, the one Julian destroyed. The screen is cracked, but the phone might still work. If I can recover the data," she trailed off, but we were both thinking the same thing. I spent the next hour with Maria and Leo, getting their story on record, taking notes about every instance of mistreatment they or their parents had experienced. By the time I left, we'd exchanged numbers and I'd promised to be in touch. Walking back to the main house, I felt different. Not devastated or heartbroken, but clear-headed and purposeful. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Julian was waiting for me in the front hall, his face stormy. "Where the hell have you been? We need to talk about your behavior today. You can't just storm off like that, making wild accusations, siding with trespassers over my family." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized I felt nothing but pity. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'll call a car to take me back to the city." "Don't be dramatic," Julian said. "You're upset, I get it, but running away isn't the solution. We can work through this." I pulled off the engagement ring, that obscene diamond I'd only been wearing for a few weeks, and held it out to him. "I'm not upset, Julian. I'm clear. For the first time since I met you, I'm seeing everything clearly. You're not who I thought you were. Or maybe you are, and I was just too flattered by your attention to see it." He didn't take the ring, so I set it on the hall table. "You and your family are cruel people, hiding behind charm and money and pretty words about values. You treat people like they're disposable, like they don't matter, like their suffering is just background noise to your perfect life. And I almost let myself become part of that. I almost convinced myself I could live with it, but I can't." Julian's expression cycled through surprise, anger, and then something calculating. "You're making a huge mistake, Ava. Do you have any idea who my family is? What we can do to your career? Your reputation?" The threat was clear, and it should have scared me, but instead I felt a rush of determination. "Do your worst," I said. "I'm a journalist. I investigate corruption and abuse of power, and your family just became my next story." I called a car service, gathered my overnight bag, and left the Davenport estate without looking back. The ring sat on that hall table, rejected and forgotten, exactly where it belonged. The drive back to the city felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. I called my mother from the car, and when she answered, I just said, "Mommy, you were right. About everything." I heard her exhale, a sound full of relief and sorrow. "Oh, mija, I'm sorry. Are you okay?" I thought about that question. Was I okay? My relationship had just imploded. I'd alienated a powerful family. I'd probably made enemies who could make my professional life difficult. But I felt lighter than I had in months, free from the constant pressure to perform, to be someone I wasn't. "Yeah, Mom, I think I actually am." Back in Brooklyn, back in my fifth-floor walk-up with the creaky floors and the view of another building, I sat down at my laptop and opened a new document. I titled it The Davenport Investigation and started writing everything I'd seen and heard. Every red flag I'd ignored, every moment of casual cruelty, every warning sign I'd rationalized away. It was cathartic and painful and necessary. Then I started making calls. I reached out to every former Davenport Industries employee I could find through LinkedIn, through public records, through 6 degrees of separation. I contacted business partners who'd had falling outs with the family. I tracked down other people who worked for wealthy families in their social circle, figuring if the Davenports treated their staff this way, they weren't unique. Each conversation revealed new patterns of abuse and exploitation. Maria called 3 days after I'd left Connecticut. I got into Leo's phone, she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. The screen was destroyed, but I was able to extract data from the memory chip. And Ava, he had his voice recorder running when he was chasing that kite. He uses it to practice English pronunciation. It captured everything. Julian's threat, every word, perfectly clear. We met at a coffee shop in Queens, neutral territory, and Maria played me the audio on her laptop. Hearing Julian's voice, cold and threatening, telling a child that he'd destroy his family over trespassing after a kite, it was even worse than I remembered. "This is evidence," I said. "This is proof of who he really is." Maria nodded. "What are we going to do with it?" Over the next 3 weeks, Maria and I became partners in something that felt bigger than revenge. She had technical skills I lacked, knew how to dig into public records and financial databases. I had investigative training and media contacts. Together, we started building a case that went beyond just Julian's cruelty to a child. We looked into the Davenport Foundation, the charity that Harrison used as a political prop. What Maria found in the publicly available tax records was damning. The foundation took in millions in donations from wealthy supporters, ostensibly for community development and education programs. But the vast majority of that money went to administrative costs and consultant fees paid to companies that, when we dug deeper, were owned by family friends or political allies of Harrison's. The actual charitable work was minimal, performative, designed for photo opportunities rather than genuine impact. I tracked down people who'd applied for foundation grants and been rejected despite meeting all the criteria. Several told me stories about how the foundation prioritized applications from politically connected families over genuinely needy recipients. One woman, a teacher who'd tried to get funding for a school in an underserved neighborhood, told me, "They said my project wasn't aligned with their mission." Then I saw them give twice the amount I'd requested to renovate a tennis court at a private school where Senator Davenport's nephew goes. It's a scam, but nobody wants to say it publicly because the family is too powerful. Every interview, every document, every piece of evidence painted the same picture: a family that had built their reputation on a foundation of cruelty, exploitation, and fraud, hidden beneath a veneer of philanthropy and public service. Julian wasn't an aberration. He was exactly what you'd expect from being raised in that environment, learning from birth that power meant never facing consequences. Julian kept trying to contact me during those weeks. His messages evolved from confused to angry to threatening to pleading. He sent flowers to my office with notes asking me to be reasonable. He showed up at my building twice, standing on the sidewalk looking up at my windows like some romantic hero, not seeming to understand that his behavior was bordering on stalking. When I didn't respond, he started sending messages through mutual friends, suggesting I was having some kind of breakdown, that I was letting my insecurities ruin a good thing. My editor at City Voice, Rachel Kim, called me in for a meeting about 3 weeks after I'd left Connecticut. "I got a very interesting phone call this morning," she said, "from a lawyer representing the Davenport family, threatening legal action if we publish anything defamatory about their clients." She leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Want to tell me what you're working on?" I told her everything: the relationship with Julian, the visit to Connecticut, what I'd witnessed, the investigation Maria and I had been conducting. I played her the audio of Julian's threat to Leo. I showed her the documentation of the foundation's financial irregularities. I shared the interviews I'd conducted with former employees and grant applicants. Rachel listened to everything, making notes, asking sharp questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "This is the story, Ava. This is exactly the kind of investigative journalism we should be doing. But you understand that if we publish this, the Davenports will come after us with everything they have, right? Lawsuits, pressure on our advertisers, attempts to discredit you personally. They'll try to frame you as a bitter ex-girlfriend with an axe to grind." "I know," I said. "But the evidence speaks for itself. We have documentation, multiple witnesses, audio recording. And more importantly, it's true. It's important. These people have been hiding behind their privilege and their political connections for decades, hurting people with impunity. Someone needs to hold them accountable." Rachel nodded slowly. "Okay, let's do it. But we do it right. Every fact triple-checked, every source vetted. Our legal team reviews every sentence. We make this bulletproof." The next 2 weeks were the most intense of my professional life. I worked 16-hour days, cross-referencing every detail, confirming every claim, making sure our story was unassailable. Rachel assigned 2 other journalists to help with fact-checking and additional reporting. Our legal team pored over every paragraph, making sure we were on solid ground. Maria continued to dig through financial records, finding more evidence of foundation fraud and corporate malfeasance at Davenport Industries. We interviewed more than 40 people for the story. Former employees, business partners, political rivals, other journalists who'd tried to investigate the family but been shut down. A pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. The Davenports weren't just cruel to their immediate staff. They were systematically predatory, using their power to crush small businesses, exploit workers, and enrich themselves while maintaining this public image of benevolent aristocracy. One former business partner, a man named David Chen, no relation, told me about how Harrison had forced him into a partnership that effectively stole his company. I was young, desperate for capital, and he offered to invest. The contract was complex, full of clauses I didn't understand. Within 6 months, he'd maneuvered me out of my own company, taken it over, and left me with nothing. When I threatened to sue, his lawyers buried me in motions and legal fees until I couldn't afford to fight anymore. He did it all with a smile, talking about the importance of business being business. Julian's pattern was similar to his father's but more personal. Several young women who'd worked in his office came forward anonymously, describing a workplace culture of intimidation and subtle harassment. He never crossed lines that would trigger formal complaints, but he created an environment where young female staffers felt constantly evaluated on their appearance, where their professional competence was always secondary to whether Julian found them attractive or useful. One woman said, "He'd compliment you in ways that felt slimy, then deny there was anything inappropriate about it. If you pushed back, you'd find yourself assigned to less important projects, gradually frozen out." The story took shape over those weeks, a comprehensive investigative piece that laid out the Davenports' pattern of behavior across business, politics, and personal interactions. At the center of it all was that audio recording of Julian threatening Leo, a perfect encapsulation of how the family treated anyone they considered beneath them. But we needed the right moment to publish. A story like this, it needed to break when it would have maximum impact, when the Davenports couldn't control the narrative or bury it under other news. Maria found our perfect moment. Her aunt worked at the convention center, and she'd seen the schedule for a major press conference Senator Harrison Davenport was planning for the following week. He was formally announcing his re-election campaign, with major media coverage, television networks, the full political theater treatment. "That's it," I said when Maria told me. "That's when we publish. Right when he's trying to present himself as this upstanding public servant, we show everyone who he really is." Rachel loved the idea. It's risky, guerrilla journalism, but the impact will be undeniable. He'll be standing there talking about values and integrity, and we'll be pulling back the curtain in real time. We coordinated with Maria, who'd managed to get access to the convention center's AV system through her IT contact, a technician who'd been fired by the Davenports for asking about overtime pay. The plan was audacious and probably illegal. While Harrison was giving his speech, Maria would hijack the display screens to show our article headline and play Leo's audio over the PA system. The article would go live on our website at the exact same moment, timed to the second. Every major news outlet would be in that room, with cameras rolling, capturing the chaos in real time. The night before the press conference, I barely slept. I kept going over everything, checking for holes in our story, weak points they could attack. But the evidence was solid. We had receipts, documentation, witnesses, audio proof. This wasn't speculation or gossip. This was journalism, holding powerful people accountable through verified facts. The morning of the press conference, I got dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel professional and confident. I put on my press credentials and headed to the convention center with a mixture of terror and determination. The place was packed with journalists, politicians, supporters. The Davenports had turned this into a major event, with American flags and patriotic music and all the trappings of political ambition. I found a spot in the middle of the press section, close enough to see everything but not conspicuous. Julian was there, standing near the stage with other campaign staff, looking handsome and serious in his expensive suit. For just a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been regret for the relationship I'd thought we had, but then I remembered Leo's terrified face, and the feeling evaporated. Senator Harrison Davenport took the stage to thunderous applause from his supporters. He launched into his speech, hitting all the familiar notes about family values, community service, giving back, protecting the American dream. He was compelling, I had to admit. If you didn't know better, you'd believe every word. The cameras were rolling, broadcasting this moment to thousands of viewers. Harrison was maybe 10 minutes into his speech, talking about how his family had always put service above self, when I saw Maria in the tech booth at the back of the room. She caught my eye and nodded. My heart started racing. Harrison continued speaking, something about how his foundation had helped countless families, when suddenly every screen behind him went black. There was a moment of confusion, technical staff scrambling, Harrison pausing mid-sentence. Then Leo's voice came through the speakers, young and scared, impossible to ignore. "Please, I just wanted my kite. I'm sorry." And Julian's response, cold and threatening, perfectly clear through the sound system. "This is your first lesson about how the world really works. If I ever see you anywhere near this property again, your parents are fired tomorrow, both of them, and I'll make sure they never work in this county again. I'll tell everyone they're thieves. Do you understand me?" The room erupted. People were gasping, shouting questions, pulling out their phones. The screens lit up again, this time showing our article headline in massive letters. Behind the perfect facade, The Davenports' Legacy of Cruelty and Corruption. The URL was displayed prominently, and I saw dozens of people immediately pulling it up on their devices. Rachel had timed the publication perfectly. The article went live the second those screens changed, which meant everyone in that room could now read the full story while the audio of Julian threatening a child still echoed in their ears. Harrison stood frozen at the podium, his face cycling through confusion, rage, and something that might have been fear. Julian looked like he was about to be sick, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. I stood up, and maybe 50 cameras swiveled toward me as I called out, "Senator Davenport, do you care to comment on the allegations in this article? On the audio recording of your son threatening a child? On the financial irregularities in your foundation?" For a moment, time seemed to stop. Harrison stared at me, recognition dawning in his eyes. Then chaos took over completely. Other journalists were shouting questions now, having read enough of our article to understand the magnitude of the story. Security tried to shut down the press conference, but it was too late. This was being broadcast live. Millions of people had just heard that audio and seen that headline. There was no containing this. Julian tried to leave the stage, but he was immediately surrounded by reporters. I watched him try to smile, try to charm his way through it like he always had, but it wasn't working. Someone thrust a phone in his face, showing him the article, asking him to respond to the specific allegations. His mask cracked completely. "This is bullshit," he said, forgetting about cameras. "This is a setup by my ex-girlfriend. She's unstable. None of this is real." But it was real, and everyone knew it. The audio was real. The documents were real. The 40 witnesses were real. By the time I left the convention center, our article had been shared 100,000 times. Every major news outlet was covering it. The Davenports' perfect image was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The days that followed were surreal. Our article went viral in a way I'd never experienced. It was picked up by national media, discussed on cable news, trending on every social platform. The audio of Julian's threat to Leo was played repeatedly, and each time I heard it, it felt like vindication for every moment I doubted myself during our relationship. The fallout was immediate and severe. Federal investigators announced they'd be opening an inquiry into the Davenport Foundation. The IRS began an audit of both the foundation and Davenport Industries. Several companies that did business with the family issued statements distancing themselves. Harrison's political opponents called for his resignation. Alumni groups at the schools where Harrison and Julian had served on boards demanded their removal. The Davenports fought back hard, exactly as Rachel had predicted. Their lawyers sent cease and desist letters, threatened defamation suits, tried to get our article taken down. They hired a crisis PR firm that pushed a narrative about me being a vindictive ex-girlfriend, about Maria being a disgruntled employee with an agenda, about the audio being taken out of context. But it didn't work because the evidence was too strong and too comprehensive. More people came forward with their own stories. The trickle of sources became a flood. Former employees, business partners, even some family friends who'd witnessed the private cruelty behind closed doors. Each new revelation reinforced our original reporting, adding more detail to the picture we'd painted. The Davenports weren't just one bad family. They were emblematic of a whole class of wealthy, powerful people who believed their money and connections put them above accountability. I won't pretend it was easy. The Davenports' lawyers came after me personally, filing a defamation suit that my own lawyer said was designed more to intimidate than to win. They leaked details about my student loans, my mother's work history, anything they could find that might make me seem less credible. Conservative media outlets ran segments questioning my journalistic ethics, suggesting I'd only pursued this story because I was bitter about the breakup. But for every attack, there was support. A GoFundMe appeared to help with my legal fees, and it raised far more than I needed within days. Journalism organizations issued statements defending our work. Other reporters who'd been intimidated by the Davenports in the past came forward to share their experiences. My mother, who'd been so worried about me, sent me a text that simply said, "Proud of you, mija. You did the right thing." 3 weeks after the press conference disaster, Senator Harrison Davenport announced he was withdrawing from the re-election race, citing personal matters and a desire to focus on his family. Translation: his poll numbers had tanked, and his own party wanted him gone. Julian was quietly let go from his position, the campaign citing a need to move in a different direction. Rumors circulated that he'd left the country, possibly to Europe, where the scandal had less reach. The Davenport Foundation was dissolved by court order. its remaining assets distributed to legitimate charities under judicial supervision. Several former employees filed lawsuits for wrongful termination and harassment, emboldened by the public exposure. David Chen, the business partner who'd been forced out of his own company, reinitiated legal proceedings with pro bono support from a major firm that wanted to be associated with taking down the Davenports. For me, the biggest change came about a month after everything broke. I got a call from the editor of a major national newspaper, one of the publications I'd dreamed of working for since journalism school. They offered me a position on their investigative team, covering corruption and abuse of power. The salary was more than double what I'd been making at City Voice. I accepted immediately. My first day at the new job, I found a package on my desk. Inside was a photo of Leo flying a new kite, his smile wide and genuine, with Maria beside him in cap and gown. The note said, "Thank you for showing us that powerful people can be held accountable. I got accepted to MIT with a full scholarship. Leo wants to be a journalist like you when he grows up. We're starting a consulting firm focused on helping whistleblowers expose corruption. We're naming it after you. Love, Maria and Leo." I pinned that photo to my cubicle wall, right next to my press credentials. It reminded me every day why this work mattered, why speaking truth to power was worth the risk and the cost. Some former colleagues asked if I regretted the relationship with Julian, if I felt like I'd wasted months of my life, but I didn't see it that way. Sometimes you have to get close to darkness to understand how to fight it. Sometimes you have to experience betrayal firsthand to recognize the warning signs in others' stories. Sometimes the worst experiences teach you the most important lessons about who you are and what you stand for. I'd almost let myself be absorbed into a world that valued appearance over substance, power over kindness, wealth over humanity. But I'd walked away, and in walking away, I'd found my purpose. 6 months after the press conference, I covered a story about Maria's new consulting firm helping expose fraud at a Fortune 500 company. The whistleblower they'd assisted was a low-level employee who'd been ignored by traditional channels, but Maria's technical skills and my reporting experience had helped build a case that led to federal charges. We'd become an unofficial team, working on projects that held powerful institutions accountable. I saw Julian one more time, by accident. I was at a cafe in Manhattan working on a story when he walked in. Our eyes met across the room. He looked different. Less polished. More uncertain. For a moment I thought he might come over, might try to talk to me, but he just nodded slightly and left. I watched him go and felt nothing but relief that I'd escaped that life. My mother and I had dinner that night at her apartment in Queens, the same small kitchen where she'd warned me about people like the Davenports. "I wish I'd listened to you sooner, Mommy," I said. She reached across the table and took my hand. "You listened when it mattered, Mija. That's what counts. Sometimes we have to learn hard lessons ourselves before we really understand them." Standing in Times Square that day, watching the Davenports' empire crumble on every screen, I hadn't felt triumphant or vindictive. I'd felt free. Free from the version of myself that had been willing to ignore red flags for acceptance. Free from the need to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's world. Free to be exactly who my mother raised me to be, someone who speaks up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The engagement ring was probably still in that trash can somewhere, or maybe it ended up in a landfill. Either way, it was exactly where it belonged. And me? I was exactly where I belonged too, telling stories that mattered, holding powerful people accountable, and building a life that was mine on my own terms. That was the best revenge there was, better than any ring could ever be. Living well, living honestly, and refusing to let anyone make you complicit in their cruelty. Here's what I learned through all of this. The perfect facade isn't just about wealthy families or corrupt politicians. It's about anyone who makes you feel like you have to hide parts of yourself to be worthy of love. It's about relationships where you're always walking on eggshells, always making yourself smaller, always sacrificing your values to keep the peace. And the most important thing I learned? You don't owe anyone your silence, especially when that silence protects their ability to hurt others. So let me ask you this. Have you ever ignored your instincts to maintain a relationship? Have you ever made yourself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who you should be? And most importantly, when you saw who they really were, did you have the courage to walk away? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters, and you never know who might need to hear it. If this resonated with you, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and standing your ground. Remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is simply, "I deserve better," and then prove it by walking away.